friends, welcome or welcome back to my channel. My name is Sasha. Today we are going to be talking about the very first book that I read with my brand new book club. You can read with us for disabled, queer, and diverse readers who like to read from own voices authors in those categories. Because this was our first book of our first month of our first official meeting, I did pick it myself, and in the future, for all of our future meetings, it will be voted on by our book club members. So the very first book I picked was His Tesoro by Amelia Rossi. I never get her name right the first time I try to say it, and it pisses me off. Because it's like, brain, what are we doing? Who are we thinking of? I don't know. I don't even know why I was going with Emily. That's not even close to right. As you can see by this gorgeous cover, our main character is in a wheelchair, and when I tell you this book was already on my radar, I squealed. I was so freaking excited to see a main character in a wheelchair on a cover, and since then I have sought out other disabled authors who also have main characters in wheelchairs on covers, and now it's like I've unlocked a whole new world and I'm so excited about it. I just am thrilled. So let me give you a little backstory on what I've read already from Amelia Emerson / Rossi. Rossi is the name she writes under for her Mafia romances. Emerson is the name she writes under for her Omegaverse. So I have read Forbidden Part 1 and Part 2 of her Omegaverse series. I've also read Cherished, which you can see right over here from her Omegaverse series, and then this one right here is A Pack for Autumn, which is another Omegaverse series. So I started with the Omegaverse. Forbidden Part 1 and 2 had some very dark scenes in them. So what I was expecting from this, which I was under the impression was a dark mafia romance, was some very dark shit going on. And I think I have maybe spoiled isn't quite the right word. The last dark sort of mafia romance book I read was Servitude to the Serpents, which is the darkest book I've ever read in my whole life. So I think maybe going from that into this, I didn't quite get what I was expecting out of it. I also haven't written my review for this yet, and that is, when I write my reviews, it's sort of where I collect all of my thoughts, and they come out a lot more precise, because I have a chance to edit them, obviously, and to rearrange where I want to talk about things. And so if you would like to see my written review, please head on over to my blog, Read With Me, Sasha Marie. So forgive me if this is just a jumble of, oh yeah, and this happened, oh yeah, and I thought this, oh yeah, and it's like, it's not going to be as pristine as some of my other reviews, I feel like. I'm also planning on not posting this video until after our book club meeting in January, so I am currently filming this in December. I'm sure I'll have more or additional or different thoughts after the book club meeting, so maybe if you want to chat about this book down in the comments, I might have some other additional things to say by then. So because I was so familiar with Amelia Emerson's writing for her Omegaverse books, I was a little surprised at the chapter length of some of these chapters. It felt, and this was kind of like my overall feeling for the writing, it felt a little disjointed, and it felt like we skipped 2 different scenes, or like things didn't play out as long as they would have in her Omegaverse book. Specifically for spicy times, those, it was like you would get most of the scene, but what would take 3 or 5 pages in an Omegaverse was 1.5 in this. So that was a big difference. And I'm just wondering if it's such a different audience that she's writing for the Mafia romance girlies for this, and that's what they like, which no judgment, that's fine. I was just coming from Omegaverse, where it's the first time they're hooking up, we're doing things I had to Google because I didn't know what it meant, and that was the mindset I was coming from. So it was a little bit jarring to be oh, this reads a lot differently than the Omegaverse. This is written a lot differently than the Omegaverse, and not just that I don't mean the Omegaverse characteristics were missing, and I missed that. That's obviously not being taken into account at all. Um, but the way that things sort of progressed and the way that we moved from scene to scene sometimes felt a little bit choppy. And it was like confusing sometimes the way chapters would end, or we would switch perspectives and points of view. And it wasn't in a way that took away from the story or made me not enjoy reading it. I flew through this book. I read it in 2 sittings. And she's not like a tiny girl. She's 400 something pages, I'm pretty sure. Maybe not. Maybe 3. What are you? 386. Okay? So I still cruised through this book, no problem whatsoever. It is different than the Omegaverse. And she is writing book number 2 in this series, which I believe is going to follow a different set of characters. And I'm honestly so excited to read it, because the other thing I was wondering, is this one of the first books she ever wrote, and then she ended up publishing the Omegaverse first, and then ended up publishing these? Or did she publish this first, and then the Omegaverse? I looked it up, and I think this was published in 2023. So this might have been her first book. I need to look. I need to check. Because that was kind of also the vibe I was getting, was like testing the waters of what's working and finding her writing voice. And it's like each character was their distinct own person, but it wasn't as like fleshed out as some of the Omegaverse characters are. And that's so much harder to do, because instead of just having the male main character and the female main character, you have the female main character and 3 other people, or 4 other people, or like however many other people are in the pack. And they each have their own point of view chapters, and they each have very distinct voices. So I feel like because I've read so much of her Omegaverse, I can't not compare the two. That's just how my brain works. And I know not everyone's going to enjoy that sort of interpretation or take, but that's where I'm coming from. When it comes to the disability rep, Amelia Emerson / Rossi never misses. Cherished is possibly my favorite like disabled representation story that I've read this year. And that's so hard to say, but it's also not, because let me just take it down for you. This isn't a Cherished book review, but we're going to talk about her because she's here. Cherished is chunky, and I read this on my Kindle and had no idea how long it was, and read it in 2 days. And I just kept being like, why is this taking so long? And I looked, and it's like over 800 pages. Cherish is the disability story I've always been looking for and never knew what it would look like fleshed out. So I am just so pleased that that trend continued in his Tesoro. Our main character has Ehlers-Danlos syndrome. She has hypermobile Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, to be really specific. She has a dynamic disability, which means that she can some days use a cane or a rollator to get around, and other times she needs to use her wheelchair because she has constant pain. She has a lot of dislocations and subluxations, and it was really well explained. And I feel like I can say that because I am someone who has hypermobile Ehlers-Danlos syndrome. And I didn't even know going into the book that that's what this character had. I just knew she was in a wheelchair, and I was sold. I was like, yes, tell me more about it. So this was such a treat for me to get the chance to read and to see a character represented. And I do want to bring in another book that has hyper Ehlers-Danlos in it. Hypermobile Ehlers-Danlos. I'm just going to call it EDS because it's a tongue twister. And that is Fourth Wing. Hot take, Fourth Wing doesn't have great disability representation. It was exciting when I was first reading it, and like also the author's extremely problematic in a lot of other ways, so I don't promote that book or that author on this channel or anywhere on my social media, but I need to bring it up to show you the difference between like, this is what you think is good, this is what is actually good. So, with Fourth Wing, the representation was like, oh, I'm flexible, so like, we'll have really great sex. And that was the Fourth Wing representation of it. And then in this book, it was him buying her body pillows and him researching how to do shibari in ways that would hold her ligaments and joints together instead of separating them. And it was him doing all of this research to make her sexual experiences less painful, more enjoyable, and all around a good time. He did so much to care for her in so many ways, and it wasn't just like, oh, she's flexible, so we're gonna have fun in bed. It was him realizing, if I do this too rough, I'm gonna dislocate something. If I do XYZ, I'm going to hurt her. Not like, oh, she can throw her leg behind her head, so like, let's have a great time. Like, that might be the reality for some people with EDS, and if that's your reality, live your truth. Like, I love that for you specifically. But please understand that for most people with EDS, it can be an extremely painful experience, and over time that can be traumatic, and I think it was done so well that without her having to explain any further or to be like, no, I can't do this, because he took the initiative to look it up, to speak to a doctor, to see what she might need. He even went to a dungeon master and asked him, like, hey, I have a new partner, these are their needs, how can I do this safely? 100 out of 10 on the representation, also on the consent in this book, so well done. And these are things that I think was worth it, especially for my book club where we focus on disabled voices. Not just disabled voices, like I mentioned, but this book is specifically disabled. I think this is a great place to start because this was really good representation, and I'm really curious and excited to talk about it with my book club members, and because not all of us have the same things, and I can't wait to see their thoughts on how this was done. As someone with the same condition and who doesn't have it to that severity, right? Because I do use a rollator occasionally, but more often than not, I just go about my life walking as far as I can. My dislocations happen more often than not when I'm asleep. And I'll dislocate my neck, my hip, my knee, my shoulders, my elbows, my thumbs. I have a really bad time when I sleep, even though I have all of the pillows and things that were described in this. It's extremely challenging for me to sleep in no pain. So I just related so much to this character, and I appreciated that. It was also a huge discussion of not feeling less than and still holding on to your power, even though your ability to move and function through life looks different from everyone else. And it was just such beautiful commentary on so many different aspects of her disability and her life. As far as the Mafia part goes, we did have, like, rival Mafia people to worry about. We did have traitors and things to worry about. Like, there is stuff going on at the same time that these two characters are forced into a marriage. They've never met before. He didn't know she was disabled when they got married. And so it was sort of fun to see a little peek behind the curtain into the Mafia lifestyle. I personally like a lot darker books than this, and I think this is a good entry-level book for Mafia romance, which is great that I have something to recommend now because it also happens to have really great disability representation. So it's like, if you're just trying Mafia romance for the first time, can I also tell you you're gonna have a great time with the disability rep too. So for me, it wasn't as dark as I expected it to be, but there were still moments that were very clearly, like, ticking the boxes of what you would expect in a Mafia romance, and just in a Mafia story in general. I had so much fun with this book. There's something I really want to talk about, which is, actually, I got a signed copy and a sticker. I'm not going to show you more. That was maybe my favorite part, because there is something that he gifts her in this book, and it's something I personally have wanted for a really long time, but to get one it can be upwards of like $25,000 to $50,000. And obviously, as the head of the Mafia, he has money to blow out his nose. Like, this man is so loaded, it's stupid. So he doesn't even think twice to buy her this thing that exponentially makes her life so much better in so many ways. And it was probably my favorite part of the story, was that moment when he surprises her with it, and I was just like, damn. Damn. Another reason to want a Mafia Don to find me and to have to marry me. Like, oh, darn it. So, anyway, I've just kind of been rambling at this point. I do recommend this book if you're getting into Mafia romance for the first time, because I think it will ease you into it. It's also a really great first look at some BDSM elements, some dominant submissive elements, some shibari elements, which we already mentioned. So that is like a great starting point. And then the disability representation, I personally thought was so good. There was never a moment where I was icked or I was like, that was written wrong, or that's like not really a great example of what this is like. I thought it was so good the whole way through. I do want to mention, because I didn't know that it would happen until I read the content warnings for this, and it is on the very first page. So if you don't want content warnings, skip this part. Our character does get pregnant, and that is kind of a bigger portion of the book than I would have thought it would be. I am more used to the pregnancy happening in like the epilogue and that being when you see it, but it is a bigger part of the book than I realized. And I wish I had known so I could warn my members of my book club in case that is something that is triggering for them. But thankfully, it's in the content warning on the very first pages, so hopefully all my members will read the content warnings and not have any issues with it, or if they do have issues with it, just don't read the book. That's totally okay. Because I was a little surprised, and I know people who have EDS and people who are chronically ill or disabled in general, especially people who are capable of being pregnant or not, I know that that can be a really triggering conversation, and so I wanted to say in my video, hey, just a heads up, it's gonna happen in this book, and you should be aware of that. I think that's where I'm gonna end it. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed today's review. I'll see you guys next time. Bye!